Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of lots of things, but I'm going to talk about writing today. A few days ago, I posted on some social media accounts and in my Patreon page a kind of Ask Me Anything prompt, where I said basically, let's talk about writing, let's talk about craft, and anything you want to ask about my own work. And sometimes these things are pretty quiet. They don't get much response. This got a lot of response very quickly. So I compiled a bunch of questions. Some of them require a pretty extensive answer if we're going to do the thing right. So this is going to take more than one video. I'm trying to keep my videos down to, 20 minutes or something like that, so that they don't become too unwieldy. So I'm going to take a handful of questions today, and then I'll put together another video on one of the questions, at least, that I think requires a more thoughtful consideration. And I guess, so long as people continue to send questions, including in comments on this video, I will continue to at least periodically put them together and do a kind of generalized video in which I try to answer them. Proviso, I should say, is that this is how I do things. It's not necessarily how they should be done. It's not necessarily what works for you. But the thing that I would always say is make sure that what works for you really does work for you. And that means actually producing good product, which you finish. That's the key. If I'm saying things that don't jibe with the way that you work, that's okay. If the way that you're working at the moment is not delivering in the ways that you would like it to, then maybe consider some of these possibilities. So Corinne asks, which book that you wrote was your favorite and why? This is a question I get asked a lot. And I've noticed over the years that, sometimes I would try to answer it by referencing a specific title. But what I realized is that my answers were generally the same, which was that my favorite book is always either the one I'm working on now or the one I wrote last. And it's not an accident when you think about it. It makes perfect sense that should be the case. These are the ones that I'm most invested in personally. And I think I've said this many times, if I ever write a book that I'm absolutely not invested in, there's probably something wrong with it. So I try to make sure that I'm really connected to the characters of the story, and that makes me passionate about the work. What I like about different books varies tremendously. If you know my work, I've published 26 novels at this point, and I write in a lot of genres. I write mystery and thriller and fantasy and sci-fi and a bunch of things in between, and I write some stuff for kids, some YA, young adult, and some adult. And by definition, the things that appeal to me in each of those books are going to be different. I read widely, always did. Therefore, I write widely. I write the books that I want to read. And so what I connect to in each is, in one, it might be the pacing of the story, that sort of adrenaline, the edge of your seat, excitement kind of thing that you experience when you read it. And another, it might be something reflective, some sort of fundamental truth about character or personality or whatever that I think is worthy of attention. And sometimes it might be, a phrase. Literally, sometimes my favorite part of a book might be a sentence or two where I feel like I nailed something in the description or the evocation of a feeling. So it varies, and I'm not naming specific titles, as you can tell. I'm currently working on the second Hideki Smith book, and that means that I'm thinking a lot about book one. So that's uppermost in my mind. That was also a very personal book because it's grounded in elements of my own family. And so I feel very close to it. Question from Willena. What is one or more keys to character development? Characters always have to feel real to the person who's reading the book. And, it's a truism of fiction that, even the villain is the hero of his own story or her own story. If you ever find yourself writing characters that feel two-dimensional, that their purpose is clearly to serve some element of the plot, then that's probably a weakness. One of the things I enjoy most is creating minor characters who might only appear in a single scene, but to try and get into their heads and figure out who they are and what they like and dislike, who they're angry with, and drop these little references to the stuff going on in their inner life. Maybe the character is about to die, and we'll literally only see them in that one moment. But I love doing that. I love taking something that might feel like a throwaway moment and make it have resonance because we believe in the character, that they feel real to us. I'm a Shakespeare professor and a performance person. And, Stanislavski, in training actors, floats a couple of really useful ideas, I think. Well, they're sort of related. The magic if and given circumstances. And the magic if is, if the world was like this, if I was in this situation as an actor, how would I perform? How would I behave? How would I feel and think through this moment? And the given circumstances are the things that the plot of the story sets up. What's my family situation? Where am I? What am I doing right now? What was I intending to do before this scene started? What am I trying to get out of this situation? What happens to derail my inner calm or whatever it is, right? And if you can be true to those things, then you can deliver a credible performance as an actor. And I think the same is true as a writer, that whenever you're telling anything about a person, you want to immerse yourself in it as much as possible. And you do that actorly thing where you think, this character is not me. But if I was that person, with all the sort of backstory and the character traits that have already been established, how might I respond? So I think, a form of putting yourself into everybody in the book is essential. And, again, I'm a Shakespearean. This is what Shakespeare does particularly well. There are no minor roles in Shakespeare because they all have something, some little, somebody who comes on for a few lines. A minor character might have a turn of phrase or an observation that tells you a lot about who they are. You always want to do that. As a playwright, you always want to give that to an actor so that they feel like there's some meat to the role, that they're not just a spear carrier. And I think that as a novelist, you're always trying to do the same. So grounding a sense of what is making sure that plot, it always feels subordinate to character because it's being driven by the way the character thinks and feels. Joe asks, how did you maintain the discipline needed to write novels while holding down your teaching career? Well, as the previous answer suggests, I think the two inform each other. My work as a teacher and as a critic and as a theatre practitioner, none of that is very far from the work that you do as a novelist in terms of creating worlds and characters and stories and trying to convey them, right? Teaching is primarily about communication. There were times when the two would sort of get in their way. It took me a long time to write fiction involving Shakespeare because I would find myself going into lecture mode and explaining things about Shakespeare, which finally didn't really help the story. And it took me a long time to get past that and find new ways of doing it. I did it with the Hamlet and Macbeth adaptations that I did with David Hewson, and then most recently with Burning Shakespeare, which I rewrote several times because of that very problem. I would get myself I would reread it, I'd get into the middle of the book and I would lose interest because I felt like I was being lectured by myself. So it's not like the two careers were completely separate and I had to consciously work on one or the other. The other thing is that because I had, for the last 20 years of my career, an endowed chair in Shakespeare studies, my primary responsibility was to publish. And the school recognized that my fiction was a way for the school to raise its own visibility, And so, I got credit for writing novels as well as for writing articles and books on Shakespeare. And then the other thing I would say is to be a serious writer, at some point, you have to stop thinking of it as a hobby and you have to think of it as a job. And I'm not talking about simply churning stuff out in order to get a paycheck or something. Because as I said right at the beginning, you have to finish. So a little over 20 years ago, when my son was born, and he was very premature, and he was in hospital for a long time, and then I was looking after him while my wife was at work, and I realized that I was simply not going to have the time that I used to have. Now, I had not published anything at this point. I'd been writing for 20 years. I think I'd written 8 complete novels, and none of them had been published. This was before self-publishing, so the culture, the world of publishing was very different at the time. But it really made me realize that I couldn't justify spending hours and hours tapping away on my laptop while I had a family to take care of. So in the first year that he was born, I wrote 3 novels. The first one got me my agent, who I'm still with, but we couldn't sell that novel. The second novel was a kind of mystery thriller, which also never sold. And the third one was a book called The Mask of Atreus, which became my first publication. It went to Penguin in the US and to, I think, 27 other publishers worldwide, and was a USA Today bestseller and all that sort of stuff. But that happened because I forced myself to say, I give myself a year to try and have some success with this. And if I can't find it, I'm going to have to stop, or at least I'm going to have to seriously scale it back. So that's what I did. I'm pushing it through. Every time my son was asleep, I would be at the computer working, racking up daily word count, racking up editorial processing, all that sort of stuff. And it was, in a weird kind of way, the push that I needed to turn what had been a pastime, a bit of fun, into something that was more serious, that I felt I could, maintain without feeling like I was skimping out on other stuff. DJ says, considering your extensive musical commentary, have you considered writing a book about a band on tour? Perhaps something like Almost Famous, but with fantasy elements. It's a great idea. Maybe I should. Maybe I occasionally, because I work with Tom DeLonge of Blink 182 and Angels and Airwaves, I have wondered about talking to him about a music-centered story of some kind. Maybe that's something that we'll kick around in the future. Dealing with existing music is always tricky because of copyright. One of my favorite bands is a British group called XTC. I included some song lyrics in a book called What Time Devours, a thriller that I was working on, that I wrote. It was my 3rd thriller. And I wanted to use pieces of the songs in the book, and I had to sort of reach out to the band and to copyright owners to get permission to use. I think it was a handful of lines from maybe 5 songs, total of maybe 20 lines total. And the band signed off on it. I managed to reach their manager, and the band said, fine, great, go ahead. And then it went to, I think it was Virgin Music or whoever legally owned the copyright, and they said, yeah, fine, that'll cost you $35,000. So I didn't use them. And it has always made me a little leery of trying to work with existing music. Years and years ago, I was briefly in bands, never very successful. I don't know enough about the day-to-day of recording and touring and that kind of stuff, I think, to build a story around it. I could do the research, and it would be kind of fun. But I haven't done it yet. Maybe one day I will. I do like the idea of art of any kind, of some kind, being connected to magic. So the idea of a band that somehow creates magic, I think is sort of interesting. And maybe I'll do something about Blink 182. Who knows? Shellie, common mistakes that new writers make, or what you wish you had known when you were getting started? Well, yeah, those are two separate but related questions, of course. Let's deal with the first one first. Common mistakes that new writers make. Well, as I said, not finishing. The number of times I've met writers who say, oh, I've been working on this book for years and years and years, or I was working on this and then I thought it was no good, so I decided something else, and then I started something else, and then I started something else. And I'm like, okay, but then you don't have anything. If you don't finish the book, you don't have something to share with people. Even if this is not about selling the book, even if this is not about picking up a publisher or making money off it or anything like that, you want a product, you want something complete that you can share with people, even if it's just giving it to your family or whatever, so that they can read it and say, this is a thing. This is one of the great things about being a novelist, right? Is that you can type it on your computer or write it longhand on paper. And when you type or write the end, it's a novel. It's done. Publication is a completely separate thing. It's not like a screenplay where you spend weeks and weeks working on it and you get to the end and what you have is an optimistic gesture towards something that might one day become an art object if a whole bunch of money is spent on it and a whole bunch of different people get involved. Right? A screenplay is always the beginning of a process. A novel is a thing. It doesn't have to be bound. It doesn't have to have fancy cover art. It doesn't have to be in Barnes & Noble or Waterstones. A novel is a novel. So you always want to get to that point where you have something that is finished, that you can say, here's my thing. So that's one obvious thing. The other mistake that I think people often make when they're starting out is that they chase trends. They chase what they think is popular. What's going to make me the most money? What's going to attract the most attention? What's hot right now? There's a lot of money in YA, so I'm going to write a YA novel. That's not a good reason. Not a good reason. Writing a book takes time. If you do find a publisher, say it takes you 6 months to write the book. It goes to the publisher's going to have it. If you're dealing with a traditional publisher, the publisher's going to have it for 18 months, maybe more, before it comes out. By which time the trend you were chasing has changed. It's become something else, or it's died completely. So don't do that. Plus, by the time your book comes out, it's going to clearly look like you were chasing a trend. It's impossible to be original if the moment that you pick up a book, it says on the back, in the tradition of, or like such and such a thing meets such and such a thing. We know what these things are. That means your book is derivative. It means it's unoriginal. How many different books came out on the heels of the Da Vinci Code or Gone Girl? Even if your stuff is really good, it's hard to get noticed if what you're doing is clearly imitating something that somebody else already achieved. As to, what do I wish I had known? In publishing, you're only ever as good as your last book. And by good, I'm not talking about the quality of the book, I'm talking about how well it performed in the marketplace. I kind of wish I had known that. It would have made life as a publishing author a little bit easier to bear. I think we tend to believe somewhat naively in a kind of meritocracy, that we live in a world where the quality rises to the top. And this is mostly not true. Some of it is true. For a book to get published, it has to be competent. But the stuff that does really, really well isn't necessarily the best stuff. But I think that it can take a long time for you to realize this when you're working in an industry where you temperamentally, somebody like me I have always thought, if I do the work and I dedicate myself to it and I feel like I have some spark or a bit of talent or whatever, then those things should be enough to make a book sell. And they are not. They're absolutely not. And I can tell you from personal experience, I had books that were rejected when I first submitted them, that were then picked up years later by the same publisher who had rejected them the first time. And they picked them up the second time because the market had changed a little bit, or because they thought that I was sort of semi-famous because of a previous book or something like that. But, it's not about the absolute quality of the book as to whether it gets published or whether it does well when it gets released. And I think if I'd known that earlier on, if I'd really believed that, it would have saved me a lot of soul searching and agonizing over whether my stuff was any good. Dino asks, is there a word you find you think you overuse that you strike in edits? It's funny, I was just noticing in the book that I'm writing right now how often people storm out. The number of scenes in which somebody says, and he stormed out. I'm like, okay, so yeah, I'm going to have to do a search and replace for storming out all the way through the book and rethink it. I think, these are sort of verbal habits that you get into sometimes. What else do I overuse? I will go to any lengths to avoid certain phrases that feel weird to me. This is not quite answering the question, slightly different. But, when I see somebody write something like, he gave a small laugh, it just makes my skin crawl. He gave a small laugh. It's just one of those sentences I can't imagine anybody ever saying. We don't say somebody gave a laugh. That's something that people use when they're writing bad poetry. You say somebody laughed. He gave a laugh. It's just terrible. And for some reason, I really hate using the word small as an adjective to, I don't know, he framed a small smile. That's terrible. It's just terrible. So sometimes maybe I go out of my way to avoid certain words and phrases that just feel not great to me. I'm sure there are other things that I do too much. I find myself writing about loss and absence a lot. A sort of melancholy thing that sometimes, because that's just who I am, and often I find it sort of underlying, even like the most action-driven adventure stories or something. There'll be moments where I feel that I'm maybe overplaying stuff like that, but that's because it's who I am and it's what I care about. Loss and melancholy are very much a part of me. So yeah, probably overused. Andrew F. What's the most surprising thing you've learned that you can pass on in some form when doing research for a project? Oh man. Every book that I've written requires research of some kind. And I'm constantly stumbling on things that are surprising or unexpected or cool, often in ways that then make me want to sort of reshape the book in order to make sure that stuff gets in. My first novel, Mascavatrius, that I mentioned before, hinged on stuff that I found about an all-black American tank battalion, which I was reading about. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has a good book about it called, I want to say, Band of Brothers. And I was also researching ancient Greece and 19th century excavations into Mycenae and Troy. And I found all this stuff about how Heinrich Schliemann, who was the guy who discovered Troy, stole a bunch of stuff, spirited it out of Turkey so that it wouldn't get claimed by the government, and smuggled it into Germany, where it sort of sat around in, private collections, some of it, I think, secret. And then it all disappeared during the Second World War when the Russians were liberating Berlin. And at the time, I was working on this book. It some of the stuff was popping up in Russia. And I was like, this is really cool. So, and these two radically different things, this ancient Greek stuff and the Second World War stuff, then became the core of that novel, as a way of bringing those two things together, archaeological thriller that involves the end of the Second World War. I love that stuff. The next book I did in that series was called On the Fifth Day, and parts of it were set in Naples in Italy. And I was researching And I found all this stuff about these plague cemetery under Naples called the Fontanelle. And the cemetery there is carved out of rock because, Naples sits on volcanic rock. And so, they hadn't been able to bury all the bodies. This is like a Renaissance grave, I think. It's been a while since I looked at this. And so they carved out these tunnels in the ground under the city and filled them with bones, with mostly long bones, femurs and skulls. And I found this really sort of exciting. And I was planning a visit to Naples, and I started hunting around because the Fontanelle was closed to the public. And I found a little Naples urban spelunking site where these guys went into drains and tunnels and passages, to explore. Thought, I wonder if these guys know anything about this. So I wrote to the website, and, a couple of weeks went by and I didn't hear anything. I forgot about it. And then I came back to my office. I'd been in a meeting or something, and I came back to my office, and there was a 2-line email that I received. And I still remember the wording perfectly because it gave me chills. And it said, "I am Fulvio of Naples. I will lead you under the earth." And I thought, man, if I can't get a novel out of this, I need to just hang it up. So I did, and it became a central part of what became On the Fifth Day. And it was an amazing experience. Anyway, yes, so, man, I could do this for every book I've ever written. Go through stuff and turn up neat little pieces of things that I stumbled on while I was researching. Yeah. Matthew writes, with your own writing borrowing from the real world, do you believe in writing what you know? Is that something that you bring forward in all your work, or just in certain pieces? And I think, if I remember rightly, he was specifically responding to Cold Bath Street and Written Stone Lane, which I set in my hometown of Preston in 1978, which is, when I was about the same age as the main character. Write what you know is something that people say a lot. There's a lot of truth to it, a lot of value to it, so long as you don't take it too literally. And, Written Stone Lane and Cold Bath Street are in some ways the only instances that I can think of where I absolutely trusted to my own personal experience in writing the story and the characters. And that actually came about because I had just finished writing the Steeplejack series, which was set in a kind of Victorian version of a world that looked like South Africa, in which the protagonist was nothing like me at all and lived in a world that was quite unlike anything that I lived in. I did a lot of research for it, and I went to South Africa and so on. But so I learned a lot, and I think this is the key, right? I do believe that you should write what you know, but I think that you can learn a lot, and that becomes what you know. I don't think you simply have to write your own experience. And I get a little frustrated with writers who always write about writers, for example. And I get that that's something that they really understand. And of course, as a writer myself, I often enjoy those stories to a point. But I always think, but we're not writing simply for other writers. We're not writing simply for people who grew up in the same circumstances that we did or do the same jobs that we did. Part of the point, part of the fun of writing is to go beyond your own experience and your own personality and so on, and do stuff that allows you to become somebody completely different and to discover a world that you don't know very much about. Now, I think in order to do that well, it takes a lot of work, and it can take a lot of sensitivity if you're moving beyond your own, for example, racial experience. That takes a lot of work. It's a very tough thing to do, and I think it requires a lot of consultation with other people whose experience is more innate than yours. But yeah, I think that, yeah, I guess with this question, I kind of want to have my cake and eat it too. Yes, you should write what you know, but what you know can be what you learn, as well as simply what you live. Because otherwise, every book I wrote would be about a sort of middle-aged white Shakespeare professor. I can't imagine that anybody really wants to read that, and I don't want to write it, if I was honest. Okay, I'm talking too long as usual. So yeah, I should probably wrap this up. A couple of questions here about writer's block and about planning and then plotting or writing by the seat of your pants. And I think that those things are close enough together that I want to handle them as a separate unit, and they'll probably be the subject of the next video. So yeah, I'm going to wrap this up now, but next time I'm going to talk about those kind of concerns. Organizing your writing, planning your writing, whether you plot everything out in advance or whether you just sort of make it up as you go. Keep the questions coming. I think, this might be a series. If people watch, I will continue to do these, and there are a lot of questions that I could be tackling. So feel free to add them in the comments, and I'll get to them in time. I'm going to do this in stages, but I'll get to them eventually. All right, that's it. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe, check out, of course, my books. Check out my Patreon page. Everything that I post here goes up on Patreon a few days early. So if you're one of my patrons, you get to see this stuff before anybody else. And because this channel is not monetized, the Patreon page is one of the ways that I can justify myself continuing to spend time doing stuff like this. So thank you to everybody who's a patron already. And I have a little bit of merchandise like t-shirts and mugs and stuff with dumb comments on them, which may amuse. That's it. Until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.